The colonel who gave his wife to 7 slaves, the agreement that destroyed a dynasty in America. A pale fog crept low across the soil of Charleston County on an October morning, heavy with salt air and dread, the kind of mist that clung to skin and refused to lift, even as the sun struggled to rise. By the time Plantation overseers reached the outer quarters of the Ravencraft estate, something was already wrong. Iron lay abandoned in the dirt, shackles split open as if the earth itself had rejected them. 7 enslaved souls were gone, no tracks led away. No cries had been heard in the night, only silence remained, and a single document soaked dark with blood, pressed into the mud like a confession the land could not swallow. The paper bore the unmistakable seal of Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft, a mark synonymous with authority, discipline, and unchallenged power. When local officials unfolded it with trembling hands, they sensed at once that they were holding something more poisonous than murder. This was intention made flesh, calculation carved into ink, a pact that would rot the foundations of Charleston's proudest families. Long after that morning, the mayor would whisper that no artifact had ever revealed such deliberate cruelty dressed as reason. Yet to understand what that paper truly meant, one must drift backward into the gilded illusion that preceded the nightmare. In the years just before the calamity, Charleston County stood as a monument to ambition. Cotton fields rolled outward like endless green tides, feeding fortunes that built marble facades and European dreams atop American soil. Among the elite, Colonel Ravencraft loomed large, a veteran of war turned master of land and lives. He was a man sculpted by command, towering in presence, eyes sharp as bayonets, beard trimmed with military precision. He did not ask for obedience. He expected it. From soldiers once, from hundreds of enslaved bodies now, his plantation stretched farther than most men could ride in a day, and within its borders nothing moved without his knowledge. Unlike his peers, Ravencraft did not rely on memory or instinct alone. He catalogued humanity as if it were livestock and weaponry combined. Ledgers detailed skills, bloodlines, physical endurance, and shifting market worth. Lives were reduced to columns and margins, adjusted with the seasons. To him, this was not cruelty, it was order. The same order he believed had won him wars and prosperity. Into this world stepped Cordelia Ravencraft, his promised bride, polished by Savannah society and hardened by inheritance. She was admired for her grace, envied for her fortune, and underestimated by nearly everyone. During their courtship, she listened more than she spoke, absorbing the machinery of power behind plantation life. While other women admired gardens and gowns, Cordelia studied yields and labor patterns, her questions precise, unsettling. Ravencraft mistook her curiosity for shared ambition, never recognizing the darkness that shaped it. Cordelia had been raised among transactions of flesh and profit. Her father's wealth was built not only on cotton but on the buying and selling of human beings across state lines. Compassion had no place in her education. Value did, control did. By the time her engagement was announced, the union was hailed as destiny itself, a merger of military honor and mercantile ruthlessness. Preparations for the wedding unfolded like a royal campaign. Imported luxuries arrived by ship. Music was commissioned. China stamped with entwined family crests crossed the ocean to mark the occasion. Everything glittered. Nothing warned of the rot beneath. As autumn drew near, Cordelia made her request. It was delivered not with hysteria or hesitation, but with calm purpose, over candlelight and distant thunder. In the colonel's private study, surrounded by maps and ledgers, she asked for a gift unlike any whispered before in polite society. She wanted absolute ownership and control over 7 specific enslaved individuals, not as labor, not as investment, as something else entirely. Ravencraft felt a rare tremor of unease. The request struck him as improper, even by the brutal standards of his world. Yet Cordelia framed it as contribution, as strategy. She spoke of household prosperity, of experiments in management, of proving her worth beyond ceremonial duties. Her voice never wavered. Outside, thunder rolled like a warning he chose to ignore. What followed was not an argument, but an agreement sealed between 2 minds that understood power too well. The document drafted that night did not read like a marriage contract. It read like a sentence, each word measured, each clause precise. It transferred authority in a way that defied custom, morality, and perhaps even the law. Ravencraft oft signed it with the same hand that once signed orders sending men to die. Cordelia watched, her expression serene. What occurred after the wedding was never meant to be known. The seven were removed quietly from the rhythms of plantation life, isolated under Cordelia's command. Whispers spread among the enslaved quarters, then stopped. Fear swallowed curiosity. Overseers were told to look away. Accounts were altered. Silence was enforced, until the night it all collapsed. By morning the seven were gone. So was Cordelia. Blood marked the study floor. The document lay where it could be found, as if deliberately offered to history. The Ravencraft dynasty unraveled with astonishing speed. Fortunes vanished into legal battles and secret settlements. Names were changed. Graves went unmarked. For generations, money worked tirelessly to bury the truth, to suffocate the story before it could breathe. But stories do not die when they are hidden. They wait. What remains is not just a tale of cruelty, but a warning etched into the shadows of American history. Power without conscience does not merely corrupt. It consumes, and sometimes it leaves behind a single blood-stained page, whispering of bargains that should never be made, and horrors that refuse to stay buried. Ravencraft sat motionless as the woman who would soon wear his name unfolded her vision with the calm detachment of a surgeon preparing for an incision. Her voice never trembled. Each word was measured, precise, and deeply unsettling. She did not speak of people as lives, but as components in a design. She named 7 specific souls, bound not just by chains but by blood, a complete family drawn from the depths of his own plantation. Parents hardened by years of labor, grown children shaped by endurance and obedience. 2 young ones whose futures had not yet been crushed into submission. She wanted them transferred to her alone, severed from her husband's authority by ink and seal, rendered hers in a way no Southern bride had ever demanded. Her justification was delivered without shame. This was not indulgence, she claimed, but contribution. Not cruelty, but progress. From a leather-bound portfolio, she produced notes so detailed they bordered on obsession. She spoke of the elders' hands trained in metal and thread, of how such skills could be exploited beyond their current use. She lingered on the middle generation, praising a woman who understood plants and pain, a man whose strength seemed endless, both ripe for refinement. The youngest, she explained, were the true prize, minds still soft, wills not yet broken, perfect for molding. What she withheld at first was the true darkness beneath her proposal. In letters exchanged with distant contacts far beyond Charleston, she had absorbed practices whispered about in places where cruelty had evolved into something colder and more systematic. Techniques that went beyond the whip, methods that targeted the mind, the family bond, the very idea of shared resistance. She envisioned control achieved not through chaos, but through structure so absolute it erased identity. Punishment, calibrated not to wound the body alone, but to fracture loyalty between parent and child, husband and wife. Obedience engineered until it felt inevitable. For the first time in his life, Colonel Ravencraft found himself unsteady. Her request collided violently with the rigid order he understood. Wives did not own field labor independently. They did not speak of extraction and optimization with such fluency. And yet, beneath his discomfort, something else stirred. Curiosity. Admiration. The same ruthless intelligence he prized in warfare now gleamed in Cordelia's eyes. Cotton markets were unstable. Profits wavered. Every plantation owner whispered of efficiency, of cost reduction, of squeezing more from less. What she offered was a solution cloaked in intellect. Night after night, they spoke in hushed tones. Plans took shape. The idea hardened into a doctrine they named together, a system designed to dominate not just the body but the spirit. The 7 would be the beginning. Their reactions would determine whether the method spread like a contagion across the estate. It was not marriage they were planning, it was an experiment. To make it real required silence beyond ordinary discretion. Ravencraft turned to a lawyer whose reputation was built on secrets that never surfaced. Documents were drafted with language so careful it felt predatory, ownership transferred, authority isolated, protections layered to keep curious eyes away. But Cordelia demanded more. She insisted the 7 be removed from familiar quarters, hidden in a remote corner of the land where no witness could interfere. A structure would be erected under the guise of industry, a place that appeared harmless from a distance, yet concealed something far more deliberate within. As autumn deepened, Ravencraft convinced himself this was innovation, not evil. He had always believed progress required sacrifice. He mistook his bride's hunger for control as partnership, her cruelty as discipline. Together he thought they would reshape the future of plantation power. What he could not foresee was that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of breathing. Whispers escaped their confinement. A glance held too long. A servant who heard too much. By the time October arrived, unseen currents were already moving beneath the celebration, prepared to dazzle the South. The morning of the wedding dawned flawless. Crisp air swept across Charleston County, painting the land in golden illusion. Silk ribbons fluttered from ancient oaks. Tables overflowed with delicacies meant to impress and distract. Carriages rolled in endlessly, carrying governors, judges, senators, and magnates whose combined influence could bend laws and silence scandals. The plantation became a stage, and everyone played their part. Cordelia appeared radiant, draped in foreign finery, her smile flawless, her eyes unreadable. Ravencraft stood beside her in uniform, a symbol of honor and order. The ceremony passed in applause and reverence, but the true moment waited. As tradition demanded, the groom addressed the gathered elite to announce his gift. Ravencraft had rehearsed every word. He understood spectacle, he understood power. When he spoke, his voice carried across manicured gardens and eager ears. He dismissed jewels and trinkets as shallow offerings, praising instead his bride's vision and intellect. He revealed his gift not as indulgence, but as respect. 7 enslaved individuals, legally transferred, chosen for their potential in what he described as improved management. Polite fascination rippled through the crowd. What they heard was progress, what they applauded was ambition. They did not hear the screams yet to come. They did not see the blood that would soon stain paper and soil alike. They did not understand that they were witnesses to the birth of something monstrous, dressed in ceremony and praise. And as the guests celebrated, somewhere beyond the reach of music and laughter, the 7 waited. The air grew heavy, shadows lengthened, and history held its breath, knowing that by dawn, nothing would remain the same. What no one gathered beneath the glowing lanterns could possibly imagine was that, even as glasses were raised and vows exchanged, the 7 chosen souls were already being torn from everything familiar. Hands bound, voices silenced, they were dragged away from the quarters that had once offered fragile comfort and carried deep into the pine-darkened edges of the estate. The celebration's laughter traveled nowhere near that place. There, beyond the music and perfume, Cordelia's design awakened, ready to feed. Among the guests, the announcement of the groom's gift stirred fascination rather than alarm. Many nodded with approval, their minds already racing ahead to profits and possibilities. Throughout the evening, influential men sought out Ravencraft with eager curiosity, lowering their voices as they asked questions meant only for equals. They spoke of involving their own wives, of reshaping old traditions to suit a harsher future. To them, it sounded modern, efficient, inevitable. The idea that educated women might apply intellect to plantation discipline felt like progress, not peril. Yet a few faces tightened with unease. Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, long accustomed to the broken bodies and quiet suffering scattered across the county, felt a chill creep into his bones as he listened. The way Ravencraft spoke of human lives as variables unsettled him deeply. These were not workers in his ears, but specimens. Reverend Samuel Hartwell felt a similar tightening in his chest. The language of the gift gnawed at his conscience, transforming marriage into a transaction soaked in cruelty. But discomfort has a way of dissolving beneath wine and social obligation, and neither man raised his voice above the din. As night deepened and champagne dulled sharper instincts, Cordelia herself stepped forward, radiant and untroubled. She spoke with bright enthusiasm, expanding on her philosophy with a smile that never faltered. She discussed severing emotional dependencies as if pruning roses. She described obedience as a mental architecture that could be constructed brick by brick. Her tone was light, conversational, perfectly suited to a celebration. Those listening heard cleverness, not menace. They laughed, they toasted. They failed to hear the scream beneath her words. The festivities stretched on, lavish and unbroken, unfolding across days that would later be remembered as glorious. Music echoed through the halls. Dances spun beneath chandeliers. Stories were told that would be retold for decades. Yet, while joy flourished at the mansion, something else was taking root far from the revelry. In the isolated building hidden by forest and distance, the true ceremony had begun. Months would pass before whispers reached the outside world, but for the seven, the truth revealed itself immediately. The structure that swallowed them stood far from the main house, connected only by a narrow path that twisted like a deliberate warning. Once a simple agricultural building, it had been transformed into something cold and deliberate. Walls thickened. Windows raised beyond reach, offering light without hope. Inside, corridors narrowed, leading to rooms designed not for living but for control. At the heart of it all lay a chamber Cordelia spoke of with reverence, the instruction room. Its presence alone bent the air. Metal fixtures gleamed faintly in torchlight, devices arranged with terrifying order. This was not chaos, this was design, and it promised suffering refined into purpose. The family she selected had endured decades on the plantation together, bound by love and shared endurance. Joshua and Rebecca had survived long enough to pass skills down through generations. Their children had grown into strength and reliability. The youngest still believed in comfort found in familiar arms. That bond was precisely why Cordelia chose them. She believed loyalty was a weakness to be exploited, not a strength to be honored. Her first act was separation. Doors closed. Walls rose between them. Voices were forbidden. Meals staggered. Glances punished. Any attempt to reconnect was met with consequences that rippled outward. Ensuring guilt festered alongside fear. Slowly, the silence became heavier than chains. Then came the lies. Soft-spoken and convincing, Cordelia planted doubts like seeds. A father was told his son had betrayed him. A son was told his mother wished him harmed. Words twisted trust into suspicion until even memories felt unreliable. The family's shared history became a battlefield, each bond weakened by whispered falsehoods. Her most devastating tactic turned love itself into a weapon. She forced them to compete. Tie reward and punishment to performance, not individually but collectively. One person's failure meant suffering for another. Excellence became a curse. Every action carried unbearable weight. Compassion transformed into terror. Loyalty rotted into self-blame. By winter, the cold seeped into bones already exhausted, and the system tightened its grip. The seven learned quickly that this was not discipline as they had known it. This was something colder, something intentional, a method built to hollow them out and reshape what remained. And far away, beneath crystal glasses and polite smiles, Charleston County slept peacefully, unaware that a quiet atrocity was unfolding in its shadow, growing stronger with every whispered lie and every broken bond, waiting patiently for the moment it would no longer remain hidden. Winter settled in like a slow suffocation, and with it came the conditions Cordelia preferred most. Shortened days meant darkness arrived early, pressing against walls and minds alike, stretching confinement into something endless. Time blurred inside the remote structure, measured not by sunlight but by footsteps in the corridor and the scrape of metal against stone. Cordelia documented everything, every flinch, every hesitation, every moment when defiance dimmed into exhaustion. Her journals filled with observations written in a neat, untroubled hand, cataloguing human collapse with the same cold diligence once reserved for ledgers and inventories. Nothing inside the building was designed to kill. That was intentional. Cordelia understood that broken bodies drew questions while broken spirits went unnoticed. The suffering she engineered left no obvious marks, only a constant grinding discomfort that seeped into bone and thought. Hunger gnawed without starving, cold lingered without freezing, sleep teased but never restored. Mattresses were thin enough to ache, blankets scarce enough to shiver beneath, positions enforced until rest itself became a punishment. Fatigue became her ally, eroding resistance until obedience felt like relief. Each day she arrived with ritual precision, accompanied by two men chosen not for loyalty but for emptiness. They watched without speaking, carried out instructions without hesitation. Cordelia studied her subjects as if they were reflections in a dark mirror, isolating them one by one, asking questions meant to probe fear rather than gather answers. She adjusted her approach constantly, refining techniques, discarding what failed, perfecting what shattered resolve most efficiently. What she did not understand was that relentless cruelty does not always produce submission. Sometimes it creates something far more dangerous. Inside that building, beneath layers of silence and separation, something hardened. A shared understanding formed without words. They had lost everything that once anchored them. And when nothing remains to be taken, fear loses its grip. By late winter, absence became impossible to ignore. The Kane family had vanished without explanation, and their names hung unspoken in the quarters like a curse. They had been pillars of the community, trusted, respected, woven into daily life. Their disappearance left a wound that refused to close. Questions spread quietly. Glances lingered too long, and beneath the surface dread grew. Martha Washington noticed first. Age had granted her invisibility among the powerful and wisdom among her own. From her place near the heart of the main house, she listened. She watched. She remembered. Conversations slipped past her ears, fragments of arrogance and secrecy exchanged between husband and wife, between visitors who believed themselves unobserved. At night, whispers reached her from those who dared to speak of what they had heard drifting through the trees. Sounds that rose and fell, stretching for hours, then stopping so abruptly it felt worse than the cries themselves. She began to connect the pieces. The men assigned to the distant building were known for cruelty, even among overseers, chosen precisely because nothing tied them to anyone else. Supplies arrived that made no sense for ordinary labor. Tools that belonged in nightmares, not barns. Devices meant to restrain, not correct. Wagons came and went under cover of dusk, carrying items no one wanted to name aloud. Martha called them prayer circles, gatherings cloaked in faith to disguise their true purpose. In secret corners, beneath watchful stars, people came together not only to pray but to speak, to share what they knew, to support one another in the suffocating uncertainty. Information moved from mouth to memory, repeated until it could not be erased. Names, sounds, observations. Every detail mattered. Martha insisted they be remembered by more than one person, scattered like seeds against the possibility of loss. Through these gatherings, the shape of Cordelia's work emerged in terrifying clarity. This was not discipline. It was dismantling. The breaking of identity through calculated suffering. The severing of bonds until isolation felt natural. What had been described publicly as improvement revealed itself privately as something monstrous. As winter loosened its grip, the prayer circles changed. Fear remained, but something else joined it. Resolve. The realization that what had happened to one family could happen to any of them shattered the fragile acceptance that had long governed survival. For the first time, conversations drifted beyond endurance. They spoke of choices, of actions, of resistance, whispered carefully, cautiously, but with growing conviction. Beyond the quarters, a different version of the story circulated. Among white neighbors and distant acquaintances, the Ravencraft of Plantation became a topic of admiration. Cordelia's ideas were spoken of in sanitized terms: progressive, innovative, effective. Men discussed her methods over drinks, stripping them of consequence, imagining application without cost. They praised efficiency while ignoring the silence it required. Two truths moved in opposite directions, gaining momentum. One carried by whispers and memory, the other by arrogance and denial. Both were closing in on a moment that could no longer be delayed. Inside the remote building, winter's end did not bring relief. It brought anticipation. Something shifted in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Cordelia sensed it too, though she misread its meaning. She saw changes in behavior and marked them as success, compliance, focus, stillness. She did not recognize the calm of those who have already decided there is nothing left to fear. And somewhere between the prayer circles and the pages of her journals, fate tightened its grip. The atrocity hidden in shadow was approaching a breaking point. Charleston County remained unaware, wrapped in comfort and routine, while beneath its soil a reckoning took shape. Every whisper, every scream swallowed by night, every memory carried in secret was moving toward a single, inevitable moment when silence would finally fail. Beyond the plantation gates, curiosity began to stir. Owners from neighboring counties requested private audiences with Cordelia, their letters thick with admiration and hunger. They spoke of innovation, of refinement, of methods that could sharpen profit and quiet resistance. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and soon her name was whispered as a symbol of a new era. This attention did not please her as much as it pressed upon her. Interest demanded proof. Results. The 7 she held in her grasp were no longer merely tools for her private ambitions. They had become evidence, living demonstrations of a theory she intended to unleash upon the region. Failure was unthinkable. Success would crown her a visionary. As spring crept closer, she saw the coming planting season as the final judgment. 5 months of deliberate torment had been invested, and soon the Kane family would be released back into the wider machinery of labor. There, under watchful eyes, their obedience would speak louder than any lecture, or so she believed. But what she had cultivated was not submission. It was resolve. Inside the hidden structure, the 7 had changed in ways she could not measure. Pain had stripped them of illusion. Isolation had sharpened their awareness. Where Cordelia saw compliance, something else had taken shape beneath the surface. A silent pact. A shared certainty that survival no longer lay in obedience, but in action. It began with David, the youngest of the adults, whose quiet strength had made him a frequent target. Cordelia sought to break him early, sensing his influence. She misjudged him. Each punishment taught him patience. Each night, alone in the dark, became a lesson in memory. He studied the building as others studied scripture. He counted steps. He listened to hinges. He learned the rhythm of keys and the habits of those who believed themselves untouchable. Cut off from speech, the family found other ways. Knocks timed to heartbeats. Scratches hidden beneath grime. Glances that carried meaning. What appeared to Cordelia as eroding bonds was, in truth, a deeper unity forming beneath her gaze. Every false accusation she fed them only strengthened their understanding of her cruelty. Every forced competition sharpened their coordination. They were no longer reacting, they were waiting. By the time warmth returned to the air, the plantation stirred with preparation. Fields were readied, tools repaired. The promise of another profitable season hung heavy over Charleston County. Cordelia watched with anticipation, convinced that her work was nearing triumph. She planned one final test to silence any lingering doubt. She chose the child. The youngest, small enough to be reshaped, valuable enough to wound deeply. Her plan was delivered without hesitation. The child would be removed permanently from her mother and assigned to the main house, visible yet unreachable, a living lesson. Cordelia believed this would prove the family's emotional severance complete, the ultimate demonstration of her success. When the overseers arrived that morning, the air inside the building felt different. Still, charged, they did not notice at first. They had grown accustomed to silence, mistaking it for fear. David stepped forward before they could speak. His refusal was calm, deliberate. It was not a plea. It was a line drawn. The first blow never landed. What followed was not chaos. It was precision. Months of observation unfolded in seconds. The family moved as one, each action measured, each strike intentional. The overseers had mastered intimidation, not resistance. They had never faced people who no longer cared if they lived beyond the next moment. The struggle was brief, brutal, final. When it ended, the silence that followed was different from the silence before. This one carried weight, meaning. The 7 stood among the fallen, breathing hard, knowing there could be no return. Blood stained the floor Cordelia had designed for obedience. Tools meant for control lay repurposed by hands she had underestimated. But this was not the end of their plan. David looked to his family, and in their eyes he saw no fear, only resolve. They understood what came next. They had understood for months. Death might await them beyond those walls, but submission had already been worse than death. What they had endured had carved certainty into their bones. Outside, the plantation moved on, unaware. Cordelia prepared reports. Letters awaited replies. The planter elite spoke of progress and efficiency. None of them sensed the shift beneath their feet. None of them heard the echo of footsteps moving not in obedience, but toward reckoning. Inside the building, the Kane family began the final phase of what suffering had forged. They gathered what they needed. They remembered every wrong, every lie, every scream swallowed by winter nights. What Cordelia had called an experiment had become something far more dangerous than failure. It had become a warning. And as the sun climbed higher over Charleston County, the shadow that had been hidden so carefully began to move, carrying with it the promise that cruelty, no matter how calculated, always creates its own undoing. For months, the silence inside the remote building had not been empty at all. It had been filled with listening, with watching, with remembering. Every footstep, every pause, every habit Cordelia Ravencraft oft believed insignificant had been absorbed, catalogued, and quietly turned into a weapon. The ones she thought broken had learned patience. The ones she believed erased had learned precision. And when the morning of March 15th arrived, there was no uncertainty left among them. They knew she would come. They knew the hour. They knew the path her boots would follow through the pines. Cordelia herself began the day as she always did, anchored in routine, insulated by certainty. She shared breakfast with her husband beneath polished ceilings and untroubled conversation, her thoughts already drifting toward progress charts and controlled outcomes. She gathered her notes with deliberate care, selected instruments meant for observation rather than mercy, and stepped into the morning convinced she was walking toward another quiet triumph. The air carried the softness of early spring, a deceptive gentleness that masked the machinery of suffering humming just beyond the tree line. Around her the plantation stirred to life. Laborers prepared fields, metals struck soil, voices rose and fell in practiced rhythm. To Cordelia it sounded like order, like proof that systems worked when pressure was applied correctly. She moved through the forest with the confidence of someone who had never been denied obedience. 5 months of calculated cruelty had unfolded exactly as planned. 7 subjects reduced, reshaped, refined, or so she believed. In her mind, they were no longer people but outcomes, their identities stripped away and replaced with compliance. She never imagined that while she had been measuring their fear, they had been measuring her. The door to the building stood open when she arrived. That was the first fracture in her certainty. The second came with the smell, blood, sharp and undeniable, cutting through the damp scent of wood and earth. Inside, the overseers lay motionless on the floor, their bodies arranged by violence that was not frantic but deliberate. The wound spoke of hands that understood where to strike, how to end a life without hesitation. Yet death itself was not the most unsettling thing in that room. It was the order surrounding it. Tools altered with intent, supplies assembled and hidden in plain sight. Exits cleared, time invested, thought invested. This was not chaos. This was preparation. The truth arrived like a slow, suffocating fog. The people Cordelia had worked so hard to dismantle had been rebuilding themselves the entire time, watching her, learning her patterns, anticipating her expectations. They had turned captivity into a classroom, suffering into strategy. And at the center of the room stood David Kane. He was not the hollow figure she remembered. His posture was steady. His eyes were clear. Whatever she thought she had erased was very much alive, sharpened into something dangerous. His family stood beside him, not clinging together in fear, but positioned with intention, each movement rehearsed, each role understood. This was not rebellion, this was alignment. When he spoke her name, there was no trace of submission left in his voice, no tremor, no plea, only control. He told her they had been expecting her, that there were matters to be addressed. What followed could not be called a discussion. It was an indictment. Piece by piece, they laid out her methods, her schedules, her manipulations. Every technique she believed secret was recited back to her with chilling accuracy. Every justification stripped bare. They did not shout. They did not rush. They spoke as if delivering testimony, because that is what it was. They understood something Cordelia had refused to see. Her work was never meant to end with them. It was a prototype, a template for cruelty that would spread, refined and repeated across plantations, across generations. Their suffering was groundwork, and escape alone would not stop it. Survival was not enough. Silence would be a betrayal. David Kane had become something far more threatening than an insubordinate captive. He understood the system because it had tried to consume him. He understood how rebellion was punished, how stories were buried, how truth was twisted into myth. And so they planned beyond the walls of that building, beyond that morning. Evidence had been gathered. names recorded, paths established to carry their story beyond the reach of those who would destroy it. What unfolded was not rage but judgment, executed with the same cold calculation Cordelia had once admired in herself. When her body was discovered later that day, it told a story no official report could fully erase. The marks spoke of intention, not frenzy, of consequence, not accident. Authorities would spend years trying to suffocate the truth, to reduce it to whispers and rumors, but damage had already been done. The program did not survive her, nor did the illusion that such experiments could remain hidden forever. It was Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft who found her, hours after concern replaced routine. The remote building revealed horrors he had never suspected, evidence of obsessions that would rot the family name from the inside out. His wife lay surrounded by the remnants of her ambition, the instruments of control now silent, accusing. In that room, the future collapsed. What had been built on suffering left nothing behind but ruin, and as the day drew on and shadows stretched long across the plantation, something irreversible settled into the land. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was watching. Waiting, carrying the echo of a truth too powerful to be buried. In the world of gospel of the haunted, cruelty never disappears quietly. It lingers, it teaches, and eventually it answers itself. What Ravencraft confronted inside that building was not the aftermath of wild defiance or blind rage. There was no chaos splashed across the walls, no signs of panic or disorder. Instead, he stepped into something far more terrifying. The space had been transformed into a deliberate exhibition of suffering, a carefully constructed revelation meant to be understood, not merely witnessed. It was as if the walls themselves had been instructed to testify. Every instrument of restraint rested where it could be seen. Every device once used to isolate, break, and reshape, the mind had been placed with intent. Nothing was hidden. Nothing accidental. The room resembled a shrine to cruelty, arranged not to glorify it, but to expose it. Labels marked each method, each stage of degradation, each calculated step in a process designed to erase identity. The precision of it all made Ravencraft's stomach turn. This was not the work of desperate fugitives. This was the work of people who wanted the truth to survive them. Stacks of written material lay organized across tables and benches. Cordelia's own handwriting stared back at him, cold and meticulous, detailing progress, resistance thresholds, psychological collapse. Her notes had been gathered, sorted, and displayed as evidence, stripped of any protective context she might have used to soften their meaning. There was no room left for interpretation. What she had done was intentional, systematic, planned. But the most devastating document waited at the center of the room, laid out as if inviting him closer. It was a complete account, written over many weeks, its language controlled and deliberate. It chronicled not only the suffering inflicted on the Kane family, but the future Cordelia had envisioned. A future where her methods spread from plantation to plantation, where human beings became variables in a regional experiment. Correspondence revealed alliances, interest, encouragement from others who saw efficiency where there was only horror. What Ravencraft had believed to be a private obsession was, in truth, the beginning of something far larger. And then there was the absence. The Kane family were gone. Not a trace of them remained beyond the story they had left behind. No stolen goods, no vandalized property, nothing taken except freedom. Their disappearance carried the unmistakable signature of planning. They had moved with restraint, destroying only what was required to remove their captors, preserving everything else as proof. It was as if they understood that survival alone would not be enough. The world would need to see. Ravencraft's first instinct was not grief, it was fear. A cold, suffocating realization of what exposure would mean, not just for his name, but for every powerful figure connected to his wife's work. Within hours, riders were dispatched, messages whispered behind closed doors. The machinery of influence began to turn. Allies were summoned, favors called in. The truth was too dangerous to be allowed daylight. By nightfall, men from the most entrenched families in South Carolina stood within the same walls, studying the evidence with pale faces and tightened jaws. They understood immediately that this was not something that could be buried quietly. The scope was too vast, the documentation too thorough, the implications too devastating. Reputation was no longer the primary concern. Survival of the system itself was at stake. They chose suppression. Not denial, not deflection, but total erasure. Law enforcement would be guided. Newspapers would be silenced. Politicians would lend their authority to a lie crafted with care. The official story would speak of a sudden uprising, of violence swiftly punished, of order restored. The truth would be labeled dangerous, unnecessary, a threat to stability, but lies require maintenance. Over the following weeks, fear spread through the plantation like a second plague. Witnesses were warned. Silence was purchased or enforced. The overseers were recast as innocent casualties. The Kane family were declared captured and executed, though no bodies were ever shown, no graves marked. The building itself vanished, dismantled piece by piece, its remains burned and scattered so no fragment could speak. Yet the documents terrified them most. The written account left behind was treated as a living contagion. Copies were rumored, paths of distribution suspected. Efforts to hunt them down extended beyond county lines, beyond comfort. Each man involved understood that if even one version survived, everything they had built could collapse. Their power depended on forgetting, on convincing the world that nothing like this had ever happened. What they failed to understand was that silence does not kill a story. It transforms it. By stripping away records, they gave birth to legend. By denying truth, they fed whispers. In hidden meetings, in hushed quarters, in abolitionist circles far from the plantation gates, fragments began to surface. The tale of the Kane family spread not as fact, but as warning, as myth sharpened by fear. Gospel of the haunted does not forget what power tries to erase. The cover-up succeeded only in the short term. The Ravencraft name began to rot from within. Business partnerships dissolved. Allies distanced themselves. The colonel aged rapidly, his confidence replaced by suspicion, his nights haunted by the knowledge that something had escaped his control. And then the letters began. Unsigned, precise, appearing in northern offices without explanation. They spoke with intimate knowledge of the plantation's inner workings, of Cordelia's methods, of the lies told afterward. They carried details no outsider could invent. Each envelope was a crack in the wall they had built around the truth. The watching silence returned, waiting. Because in the world of Gospel of the haunted, stories buried too deep do not stay silent forever. They move, they multiply, and when they rise, they do not ask permission. The letters bore the unmistakable mark of an educated hand. Their language was deliberate, composed with the precision of someone who understood exactly how disbelief worked, how doubt could be dismantled piece by piece. They did not plead, they did not accuse, they simply revealed. Each page unfolded like a slow incision, exposing details too exact to dismiss. Floor plans rendered in words, names spoken only behind locked doors, descriptions of devices never meant to be described aloud, and woven through it all fragments of correspondence, sentences lifted directly from Cordelia's own exchanges with other powerful figures who had once entertained the promise of her methods. What made these revelations truly catastrophic was not only their content, but their timing. Across the northern states, resistance to the institution of slavery was hardening into organized momentum. Reformers were hungry for proof, for documentation that could no longer be waved away as exaggeration or moral hysteria. The story of the Ravencraft Plantation arrived like an offering placed directly into their hands. Within weeks it echoed through pamphlets, lecture halls, and whispered conversations, transforming from rumor into rallying cry. Yet the most lethal damage did not come from distant critics. It came from within. Those who had once praised Cordelia's ambition, who had written with curiosity and encouragement, suddenly found themselves staring at their own reflections in the fire. Questions began to surface, quiet at first, then sharper. One by one, her former admirers retreated, contracts dissolved without explanation, familiar faces turned away in public. Blame was redirected with surgical cruelty, funneling all responsibility onto a dead woman and the husband she had left behind. By the time summer settled over the South, Ravencraft stood alone, abandoned by the very network that had once elevated him. His isolation spread into every corner of his life. Banks that had once courted his favor discovered urgent reasons to withdraw their support. Merchants demanded immediate payment for supplies that had always been extended on trust. Even casual commerce became a battlefield. And perhaps most chilling of all, neighboring plantation owners began treating his land as contaminated ground. Their enslaved laborers were warned away, instructed never to speak of what had happened, never to listen, never to carry ideas across the fences. But ideas do not respect fences. Among the enslaved population, the story of the Kane family did not fade. It grew. It transformed. It became proof that resistance was not only possible but effective. The Ravencraft off Plantation became a symbol whispered after dark, a place where submission had broken and something else had emerged. Maintaining control now required force layered upon force, each new measure draining resources and feeding resentment in equal measure. At the center of this quiet awakening stood Martha Washington. Once known only as an aging cook with a steady hand and a calm voice, she had become something far more dangerous. Through prayer circles that doubled as meetings, through careful listening and patient memory, she began assembling fragments of truth into a living network. Information traveled with the rhythm of work songs and shared meals. Vulnerabilities were noted, patterns observed, connections extended beyond the plantation into Charleston's free black communities, into spaces the masters believed were invisible to them. What began as an act of remembrance became strategy. By autumn, the consequences could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Across the region, overseers vanished without sound. Equipment failed in precise, devastating ways. Crops were ruined not by chance, but by knowledge. Every act bore the signature of planning, of someone who understood how plantations functioned from the inside. Authorities whispered of coordination, of intelligence moving faster than they could trace it. Fear crept upward, infecting the very men who had once believed themselves untouchable. Ravencraft oft responded with desperation. He poured what little wealth remained into security. New overseers were hired, watched as closely as those they were meant to control. Fortified structures rose where fields once lay open. Guards patrolled endlessly, their presence a constant reminder that power now required defense, but each precaution deepened the wound. Every coin spent revealed how fragile his position had become. Every locked door announced that resistance was working. By winter, the plantation no longer resembled a place of production. It felt like a siege. Workers were confined, movement restricted, trust non-existent. Cotton rotted in the fields, livestock disappeared. Buildings bore scars inflicted despite constant surveillance. The air itself seemed charged with suspicion, as though the land remembered what had been done upon it. The collapse did not arrive with fire or bloodshed. It arrived through numbers. The cost of control exceeded the value of what remained to be controlled. Ravencraft could no longer sustain the defenses he believed essential, yet to dismantle them would invite ruin. Trapped between fear and insolvency, he watched generations of wealth dissolve into debt and silence. The legacy he had inherited curdled into shame, and so, faced with inevitable collapse, he made the final choice. On a cold morning in early January, Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft issued an announcement that rippled through the planter elite like a death knell. The details would shock his peers, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed what many had already feared. The Ravencraft dynasty was finished, and somewhere beyond the reach of ledgers and titles the watching silence endured, carrying forward the truth that cruelty once unleashed does not end with its creator. In Gospel of the Haunted, resistance does not always arrive as rebellion. Sometimes it arrives as memory, sometimes as knowledge, and sometimes as a reckoning that spreads quietly until it is everywhere. The truth, when it finally surfaced, arrived not as a revelation of conscience but as a weapon of survival. Standing alone in the fading light of his once grand parlor, Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft found himself surrounded by the ghosts of wealth already slipping from his grasp. The furniture would soon be auctioned. The portraits would be stripped from the walls. The name that had once commanded respect now echoed with suspicion. And so, with enemies already circling and allies long vanished, he spoke. He confessed, not because he felt remorse, nor because his heart had awakened to the suffering inflicted in his name, but because he understood the mathematics of ruin. Others already possessed fragments of the truth, enough to annihilate him. By revealing the rest himself, Ravencraft hoped to shape the collapse, to direct its force outward rather than inward, to ensure that he would not fall alone. In exposing his wife's work, he intended to drag every accomplice into the light beside him. What he revealed was not an isolated horror, but a design. Cordelia's program, he admitted, had never been meant to end at one plantation. It was conceived as a prototype, a controlled demonstration for a future in which cruelty would be refined, standardized, and exported. Letters passed between estates like blueprints, advice flowed freely, resources were shared, her methods were discussed as innovations, praised for their efficiency, admired for their potential to erase resistance by dismantling the human will itself. The wedding guests who had toasted progress had been celebrating the birth of something monstrous. Name followed, dates, transactions. Ravencraft oft spoke of prominent families who had funded the work, of influential figures who had offered counsel, of men who had waited eagerly for proof before unleashing similar regimes upon their own lands. Even more damning were the officials who had known. Sheriffs, judges, politicians. They had been informed, reassured, bribed with promises of shared success. Protection had been arranged in advance. Laws had been bent before they were ever tested. The suppression that followed Cordelia's death, he confessed, was no panicked reaction. It was procedure. Witnesses were silenced, evidence destroyed, false statements rehearsed and delivered with confidence. The machinery of authority had moved smoothly, efficiently, as it always did when preserving itself. But buried within Ravencraft's confession was something he had never intended to share. As he recounted the aftermath of the confrontation, details emerged that reshaped everything authorities believed they understood. The Kane family had not fled blindly into the wilderness. They had moved with purpose. Documents recovered after March 15th revealed connections forged long before the escape, quiet communications established across boundaries of color and class. Abolitionist networks had not merely received them, they had been waiting. At the center of this transformation stood David Kane. Ravencraft described him not as a laborer, not even as a rebel, but as something the system had never prepared for. David had understood plantations not only as places of labor, but as mechanisms. He recognized their weaknesses, their dependencies, their patterns of fear. He learned how information traveled, how authority reacted, how profit dictated response. And he used that knowledge. The intelligence flowing north did not stop at testimony. It became instruction, escape routes mapped from memory, vulnerabilities catalogued and shared. Economic pressure applied with surgical precision. Plantations hundreds of miles apart began suffering identical failures, as if unseen hands were tightening across the region. Crops spoiled without explanation. Equipment malfunctioned at critical moments. Labor became unpredictable in ways that suggested coordination rather than chance. Authorities traced fragments of this disruption back to northern cities, to gatherings where formerly enslaved individuals spoke not only of suffering, but of strategy. They did not plead for sympathy. They offered insight. And the insight was devastating. What terrified the defenders of slavery was not rebellion itself. It was competence. The Ravencraft incident proved that systematic brutality did not always produce submission. Sometimes it produced clarity. Sometimes it forged minds capable of turning the tools of oppression back upon the system that created them. The very techniques designed to erase resistance had sharpened it instead, transforming victims into architects of collapse. The final revelation in Ravencraft's confession stripped away the last illusion. Cordelia Ravencraft, he admitted, had not died in the chaos of a sudden uprising. The evidence he had initially hidden told a far more unsettling story. She had been taken alive. For a time measured not in minutes, but in deliberate stages, she had been made to experience her own designs. Each method she had perfected was returned to her with intimate accuracy. Every manipulation, every calculated deprivation, every psychological pressure she believed necessary to break another human being was administered by those who understood it completely. She had been taught. Her death, when it came, was not swift. It was instructional, a mirror held unflinchingly in place until comprehension arrived too late to matter. The Kane family did not seek chaos. They delivered consequence, and in that truth lies the real terror of this story. Not ghosts, not curses, not things that creep from darkness unseen, but the cold realization that the greatest horrors in American history were engineered in daylight, justified by profit, and executed by people who believed themselves reasonable. In Gospel of the Haunted, evil does not howl, it calculates. And sometimes, when pushed too far, it teaches its creators what suffering truly means. The silence that followed Ravencraft's confession did not close the story. It listened, and somewhere beyond the reach of titles and tribunals, the reckoning continued to move, quietly, patiently, carrying with it the knowledge that cruelty, once unleashed, never belongs solely to those who wield it. What do you believe was truly revealed, and what truths are still waiting to be spoken? The question still lingers like dust, trapped in old paper and sealed drawers, whispering through forgotten corridors of Charleston County. Are there truths still sleeping in those archives, pressed flat beneath official ink and polite omissions, waiting for the wrong hands or the right eyes to uncover them? Because stories like this do not end when the last witness disappears. They sink, they wait, and they endure. The Ravencraft of Plantation itself did not survive the year. By late winter, the land had been deserted, its grand structures surrendered to rotten silence, while creditors circled like scavengers, tearing apart what little value remained. The mansion that once hosted celebration and confidence stood hollow, its windows dark, its halls stripped of warmth and purpose. As for Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft, he vanished from public record, almost as completely as his fortune. Some claimed he fled south, seeking anonymity beyond borders. Others insisted he chose a quieter end, unable to endure the weight of what he had revealed. No grave ever settled the argument, yet the destruction of one man's legacy was only the surface tremor of something far larger. The true consequence of the Ravencraft affair rippled outward, altering conversations, strategies, and fears across an entire nation divided against itself. Cordelia's calculated program of domination, and the defiance it forged in the Kane family, became symbols that refused to fade. In the North, the details of her methods circulated like a contagion, stripping away comforting illusions. Abolitionist circles clung to the evidence as proof that cruelty was not an accident of slavery but its engine. What had once been debated in theory was now written in suffering, undeniable and precise. But the deeper transformation occurred far from lecture halls and pamphlets. Among the enslaved, the Kane family's story moved quietly, passed mouth to ear, carried across fields and rivers. It did not promise easy freedom. It promised something far more dangerous, possibility, the knowledge that even systematic torment could fail, that intelligence, patience, and unity could fracture what appeared unbreakable, that survival did not always mean submission. The networks David Kane helped ignite did not dissolve with distance or time. They adapted, they spread, they learned. Information became currency. Roots emerged where none had existed. Plantation owners began to sense a change they could not explain, a resistance that felt coordinated rather than chaotic, strategic rather than desperate. By the middle of the century, disruptions appeared in patterns too precise to ignore. Crops failed in concert, labor faltered simultaneously. Systems designed to extract obedience instead revealed their fragility. What terrified those in power was not violence, but understanding. The Ravencraft incident had exposed a truth they could never again deny. That relentless cruelty does not always crush the human spirit. Sometimes it sharpens it. Sometimes it creates minds capable of dismantling entire systems from within. The Kane family had not survived by chance. They had evolved. Long after the plantation collapsed, the land itself became a vessel for rumor. Visitors spoke of strange lights drifting through the ruins after dusk, of echoes where no voices should remain, of figures moving slowly through overgrown fields as though searching for something lost. Whether these tales were born of imagination or memory mattered little. The place had absorbed too much pain to ever feel empty again, yet the most unsettling legacy was not the legends. It was the lesson. The horrors that unfolded there did not rise from superstition or madness. They were designed in daylight by educated people who believed themselves moral, progressive, and justified. Cordelia's work was not an aberration. It was a proposal, a vision of efficiency built on the erasure of humanity, and it was nearly adopted. Scattered documents survived the purge. Letters, notes, testimonies hidden in private collections and distant libraries. Together they form what historians would later call the Ravencraft Papers. They do not simply document brutality. They reveal how oppression organizes itself and how resistance learns to answer. Today, little remains where the plantation once stood. Stones half buried in soil, a marker that speaks politely of agriculture and enterprise, carefully avoiding the truth beneath its polished surface. But those who know where to look understand that history is not erased so easily. Beneath the ground, beneath the silence, the story still breathes. The wedding gift of 7 human lives was meant to prove that cruelty could be perfected. Instead, it proved something far more dangerous. That when power convinces itself some lives matter less, it plants the seeds of its own undoing. And in Gospel of the Haunted, that is the most chilling truth of all.